There has been ongoing debate about whether Richard Kuklinski was a serial killer or a hitman. However, as you will see in this documentary, there is essentially no difference between the two, as both result in the tragic loss of multiple human lives. Welcome to Organized Crime Files. Richard's father was Stanisław Kuklinski, known as Stanley, a Polish immigrant from Warsaw who worked as a brakeman on the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. His mother, Anna McNally, was born to Irish parents and grew up in an orphanage with her two brothers after both of their parents died. Anna had a traumatic experience at the orphanage. She was sexually abused by a priest from the age of 10 and subjected to severe mistreatment by sadistic nuns. Despite her difficult upbringing, Anna blossomed into a beautiful woman and soon caught Stanley's eye. Within 3 months of their meeting, he proposed, and they were married in July 1925. From the very beginning, Anna realized she had married a jealous and abusive man who had a penchant for alcohol. He beat her and sexually abused her at the slightest provocation. Stanley's mistreatment of Anna intensified when he was drunk. His temper would flare, and his sexual appetite would grow, causing him to throw Anna around like a rag doll. Divorce wasn't an option back then, and Anna learned to accept her lot. In spring 1933, Anna gave birth to her first child, a boy they named Florian after Stanley's father. The birth of his son did nothing to stop Stanley's abuse, and Florian also became a target for his temper. Anna grew to detest her husband and sought solace in the church. Anna fell pregnant again, likely the result of rape, and on the 11th of April 1935, she gave birth to a second son named Richard. The arrival of Richard only meant that Stanley had another target for his anger. With money now tight, both Florian and Richard were frequently beaten, leaving the boys terrified of their father. They felt a deep sense of dread every time he walked through the door. Anna felt powerless to stop her husband, so she gave up trying and allowed the abuse to continue. Richard was so terrified of Stanley that he wet himself every time he saw or heard him. This just stoked his father's anger, and he took to beating both his sons with a belt he wrapped around his knuckles, sometimes knocking them out cold. On February 1st, 1941, Stanley went too far. After beating Florian relentlessly on the back of his head, he killed the boy, who was only 7 years old. Stanley forced Anna to tell the authorities that Florian had fallen down the stairs, and no questions were asked. Florian's body was placed in a coffin in the family's living room, where 5-year-old Richard desperately tried to awaken his deceased brother. Their mother told Richard that Florian had been run over by a car, again covering for her husband. Richard now had to endure his father's beatings alone, often leaving him battered and bruised to the point where he could not go to school. When he did attend, the thin and frail Richard was frequently bullied by the other boys. To him, the world seemed filled only with violence and pain. He grew up wondering why his parents didn't seem to like him. This led to an inferiority complex, worsened by the teasing he faced from other kids about his appearance and tattered clothes. Richard felt isolated, having no friends and lacking self-confidence. On September 27, 1942, Anna gave birth to a daughter whom they named Roberta. Then, in May 1944, she had another son called Joseph, who, like his brother Richard, grew up to be a remorseless killer. Joseph was imprisoned in 1971 for the rape and murder of a 12-year-old girl. The arrival of 2 more children only made things more difficult at home. Stanley had begun bringing random women home and engaging in sexual activity with them in front of his wife and children, believing that as the head of the household, he could do whatever he wanted. Richard grew to intensely hate his father and, from a young age, started fantasizing about killing him. Eventually, Stanley took up with a Polish woman and spent less and less time at the family home, much to the relief of his wife and children. Anna was profoundly affected by the abuse she endured and her overall life circumstances. As a result, she became increasingly religious and attempted to instill a fear of God in her children. Richard reluctantly became an altar boy. However, like his mother, he found the nuns who taught him to be mean-spirited and spiteful, and he viewed the priests as sexually inappropriate. And over time, he developed a deep loathing for the church, rivaling his feelings toward his father. When Richard's father left, Anna struggled to provide for her children, and in turn, grew as harsh as her husband had been. It was during this difficult period that Richard began his life of crime by stealing food to feed the family. At first, his mother was horrified by his thefts and would beat him with anything she could find, including brooms, hairbrushes, pots, and pans, often leaving him covered in bruises. However, she eventually accepted the food he brought home and stopped punishing him, viewing him as the man of the house who needed to support the family. Unsurprisingly, Richard began to exhibit the same irrational rage that his father had displayed, but initially, instead of directing his anger at people, he turned to abusing animals. Dogs and cats became his targets as he devised horrific, sadistic methods to torture them. He took pleasure in hearing their screams as he set them alight or tied their tails together. Richard clearly wasn't a normal child. The details of Richard's first murder came from him after he was interviewed during his incarceration. He was never convicted of the killing or connected to it, but still, he painted a very vivid picture of what he did. By the time Richard was 12 or 13, his mother had secured a new home for the family in a brand new housing project complex at New Jersey and 15th Street. Richard loved his new home, but just as before, he was bullied and picked on by the neighborhood kids who called him a dumb Polak. With no friends or anyone to confide in, Richard started immersing himself in true crime magazines, all of which he had stolen, of course. Richard had dyslexia and found reading to be a challenge, but he would spend hours browsing through the magazines. He often went off on his own to sit quietly, absorbing the contents. It was during this time that he began to fantasize about killing and seeking revenge on the boys who taunted him. He initially turned to stealing cars, teaching himself to drive, and by the age of 13, he was already familiar with navigating a vehicle. However, the boys in the complex began physically abusing Richard in addition to the verbal taunts. On one occasion, he was beaten so severely that he couldn't leave the house for a week. Although his mother wanted to report the incident to the police, Richard understood the risk of telling on anyone, insisting to her that he would handle the situation on his own. Richard's main antagonist was a boy named Charlie Lane, the leader of the gang that had inflicted the most pain on him. Charlie was much stockier than Richard, who had grown tall and thin, although Richard made up for his lack of size with the blind rage that had been festering inside him since childhood. Richard decided he would stalk Charlie at night, planning to strike when he was alone. On a freezing cold Friday night in January 1949, Richard armed himself with a 2-foot-long wooden pole and left his home to put his plan into action. He positioned himself against a wall near where he knew Charlie would pass on his way home and waited. Eventually, he saw Charlie making his way down the path toward the wall. At just the right moment, Richard ran out and confronted him. Charlie, unfazed by Richard's sudden appearance, started calling him names as usual, but Richard fought back, stepping up to him and swinging the wooden stake against the side of Charlie's head. Richard was relentless, raining blow after blow onto Charlie's skull, fueled by years of pent-up anger and rage. When he finally stopped, Charlie lay still, very still. Richard poked and prodded him, urging him to get up and fight, but he didn't move. Charlie was dead. Richard panicked. He had just killed someone. What was he going to do? He didn't want to go to prison. He needed to think quickly and get rid of the body and any evidence. Remembering what he had learned from crime magazines, he decided to drag the corpse into one of the cars he had stolen and dump it far away. He hurried to the car he had parked in a lot a few blocks away and struggled to haul Charlie's body into the trunk. The body was much heavier than he had anticipated, so he used the icy surface to drag it along. After driving for 2 hours, Richard reached an area in South Jersey known as the Pine Barrens, a desolate, marshy region perfect for concealing a body. He pulled over on a small bridge above a frozen pond and took Charlie's body out of the trunk. Using a hatchet he found inside the car, He knocked out all of Charlie's teeth. He knew that leaving them in could lead to identification. He also used the same tool to chop off the tips of Charlie's fingers and gathered the pieces to dispose of later. Finally, he hurled the body into the icy pond. As 13-year-old Richard drove back home, he felt a sense of pride. For the first time in his short life, he felt in control. He believed he could decide who was worthy of life and who was not. Nobody would ever cross him again without facing the consequences. No one connected Charlie's disappearance to Richard, but without Charlie's influence, the other boys in the neighborhood backed off from Richard. Since the killing, Richard had developed a newfound swagger and aggression, and he sought revenge on the boys who had tormented him for so long, beating them up one by one with a piece of wood. Eventually, he began carrying a baseball bat with him everywhere he went, ready to use it if anyone crossed him. Tall for his age and surprisingly strong, he started to earn a reputation as a tough guy. However, the bat was bulky and noticeable, so he soon replaced it with a knife. Richard felt no guilt or concern for anyone, and had no hesitation about using the knife on anyone he deemed disrespectful, even though he was still just a teenager. By now, he had stopped attending school and started hanging out in the pool halls and bars. He became an accomplished player and started making money hustling. But his violent run-ins with those that didn't pay their dues was earning him a feared reputation in New Jersey and the surrounding areas. Soon, he was the leader of a gang of 5 called Coming Up Roses. The significance of the name was, if anyone messed with them, they would end up as plant fertilizer. The gang soon started planning robberies and holdups. Richard purchased his first gun from a guy in a pool hall. It was a .38 revolver with a 6-inch barrel. Richard claimed his second murder was a guy known as Doyle, a New Jersey cop who was also a drunk who hung around the pool halls that Richard frequented. The pair often had matches that Richard mainly won, but the more Doyle drank, the louder and more abusive he got, especially when he was losing money and he started calling Richard a dumb Polak cheater. The more Doyle abused Richard, the madder he got, but he also knew if he killed a cop there and then, in front of everyone, he would be banged up for years. So one evening, he quietly left the club and laid in wait for Doyle to come out. As luck would have it, Doyle staggered out drunk and got in his car. After a while, Richard realized he was asleep, so he went to the garage and purchased a can of gasoline. He then poured the fuel through the car window all over the sleeping Doyle and chucked in a match. He then stood back and watched. As Doyle was consumed in a fireball, he actually enjoyed the smell of burning flesh and hearing Doyle scream as he was burnt alive. Feeling pleased with himself, Richard went home to bed. He never told a soul about what he had done, not even his gang members. Richard slept soundly that night with not an ounce of remorse or guilt. At 16 years old, Richard had grown into an attractive young man. With his light brown hair, slim build, and Slavic features, he started to attract attention from older women in clubs and bars. Richard enjoyed the attention, began dressing smarter, and tidied up his appearance. Eventually, he met 25-year-old Linda and moved in with her. By this time, Richard had grown to resent his mother, visiting her less and less. His relationship with his sister had deteriorated as he viewed her as a loose woman. His brother Joseph was on a similar path, and although Richard tried to intervene and encourage him to stay in school, it was a hopeless endeavor. After moving out, Richard learned that his father had started coming around again, abusing his mother. Even though he had lost all respect for her, Richard tracked down his father, put a .38 to his head, and pulled back the hammer. He warned him that if he ever came near the family again, he would kill him. He later said one of the biggest regrets of his life was not killing Stanley. He never referred to him as Dad, there and then. The Coming Up Roses gang was starting to make a name for itself. They were committing increasingly bold crimes in some of the most exclusive areas of Jersey City, making good money and becoming notorious for their violence. Richard, the leader of the gang, soon developed a taste for gambling and drinking, and he became known for his extravagant suits. It wasn't long before he caught the eye of Carmine Genovese, who was not related to the infamous Mafia boss Vito Genovese, but shared a similar reputation for his dealings. Carmine was a very wealthy and powerful man in Jersey City. Carmine was impressed with the Coming Up Roses gang and wanted to bring them into his operation. However, first, they had to pass an induction process. He promised them that if they performed well, they could earn big money. Carmine handed Richard a photo of a man who lived in Lincoln Park, stating, "He has to go." Richard realized this was his opportunity to make it big. If he could align himself with organized crime, he would be set for life, as he knew the mob controlled everything in Jersey City at that time. Richard agreed that he and his gang would do the job. Although when he discussed it later with the other members, they weren't so sure. Cold-blooded murder was a whole different ballgame to what they were used to. However, despite their reluctance, Richard got them to agree. Richard would be the driver, and a guy named John Wheeler agreed to pull the trigger. The gang drove to the address of the mark. As they sat in the car, he came out of his house. Richard signaled to gang member John to pull the trigger, but he couldn't do it. He froze. As the mark drove off, they followed him and decided to have another go when he stopped at the traffic lights. But again, as they pulled alongside him, John couldn't shoot. They continued to follow him to a bar. Richard grabbed the gun and said, "I'll do it." They sat and waited for the mark to come out, and without a word to the others, Richard walked over to the man, held the gun to his head, and coolly shot him. He then strolled back to the car, and the gang drove off. The next day, they each collected $500 from Carmine, and the door to organized crime was now firmly open. The Coming Up Roses boys gained a lot of work from Carmine and earned a lot of money. They had proved that they were reliable, trustworthy, and ruthless, and would carry out the job without question. Despite earning substantial amounts of money, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars for a job, the gang members squandered their earnings on gambling, drinking, and first-class flights to Las Vegas. They never invested any of their money, and the more they earned, the more invincible they believed themselves to be. Two members of the gang, John Wheeler and Jack Dubrowski, underestimated the importance of loyalty when they decided to rob a card game organized by an associate of the notorious De Cavalcante crime family. They carried out this heist without informing Richard, their leader. One of the gang members was recognized as belonging to Coming Up Roses, and word quickly reached the Cavalcante soldier Albert Parenti. Albert summoned Richard to meet him in a bar. He explained to Richard that although he knew it wasn't his fault, John and Jack were his responsibility, and if he was to keep the respect he had earned, they had to be taken out. No questions asked. Richard was horrified. John and Jack were close friends of his, probably the only proper friends he had ever had, and now he was being asked to kill them. Richard pleaded for mercy and offered to pay back whatever money had been taken, but this wasn't about money. It was about principle, and no amount of persuading on Richard's part was going to work. There was no compromise. Richard left the bar, found Jack and shot him in the head, leaving him where he dropped. Next was John. He caught him as he left his girlfriend's apartment. In cold blood, he shot his best friend in the head, leaving him dead in the street. The killing profoundly affected Richard, but if he could kill the two people he loved like brothers, he could kill anyone. At the age of just 19, Richard had already killed 4 men. He looked way older than his years and had the strength of an ox. Word on the street was that he was responsible for killing Jack and John, and the other members of the gang steered clear of him. Richard was now on his own. In the spring of 1964, he took a ferry to Manhattan. Within hours, he had killed another man, pulling a knife on a bum who was goading and harassing him for money with ruthless efficiency. He knifed the man in the chest, watched him die, removed the blade, wiped it off, and carried on with his day. Richard later claimed that he returned frequently to Manhattan and killed random men who annoyed him, sometimes dropping their bodies in the Hudson River. Killing had become a pastime to Richard that he thoroughly enjoyed. He was a very dangerous man. A gun became his preferred method of killing, shooting just above the ear or under the jaw, so as not to get blood on his swanky suits. On some occasions, he used an ice pick, thrusting it directly in the ear or eyeball of his victims. Although he would later use other methods of killing, that included poisoning and feeding to cave rats. Richard's murderous streak was enhanced by drink, and whenever he had a few, it would inevitably end up with him murdering someone. Because he was mostly killing down and outs, homeless people and gays, the New York police did little, if anything, to try and solve the murders. Richard remained with Linda, and when she announced her pregnancy, he married her. Not out of love, but for the sake of the child. He was not a good husband. He often beat Linda, even before they were married, and his cruelty mirrored that of his father toward his mother. Linda gave birth to 2 sons, first Richard Jr., followed by David. Richard was still making money in the pool halls, but without his gang and work from Carmine Galante, who was in jail for gambling charges, his income had reduced, and he started working at more menial jobs like loading lorries. However, he was still feared in New Jersey, and on one occasion, he got into a fight over a pool game with a guy who was as tough as him. Eventually, Richard walked away from the altercation, a bit battered and bruised, and got in his car to drive home. But on the way, he was hijacked by the guy along with 2 of his mates. This time, Richard wasn't taking any messing. He pulled out a snub-nosed .38 from beneath the seat of his car and shot all 3 of them. He disposed of the bodies in Pennsylvania Bucks County, where he threw them in a bottomless cave. He then got rid of their car by rolling it into a deep section of the Hudson River. If anyone suspected Richard of killing the 3 men, no one came looking for him, and their fate was not known until many years later, when Richard made many startling confessions. When Carmine Galante was released from jail, he contacted Richard to kill another man for him, but he wanted him to suffer, as he had done something bad to his friend's wife. So Carmine asked Richard to bring back a part of him to prove he had killed him. If he did, the pay packet would be substantial. Richard was given a photograph of the mark and an address of where to find him. Richard found the man working at a car lot and approached him. He inquired about buying a car and then asked for a test drive, to which the man gladly agreed. As they drove away in the car, Richard headed toward the location where he had parked his own vehicle. He pulled up close to it and requested to look under the hood. The man was more than happy to oblige, completely unaware that in the trunk of Richard's car was a rope, a shovel, and a ratchet, while Richard himself had a .38 Derringer and a jawbreaker in his pocket. As the pair opened the bonnet, Richard smashed the jawbreaker down on the guy's head, knocking him out cold. Richard then bundled him into the trunk of his car, taped his mouth, and tied his hands and feet. He then drove to an isolated spot in Pine Barrens, the same place he had disposed of Charlie Lane all those years ago. He then tied the screaming man to a tree. Richard then smashed his ankles with the ratchet, cut all his fingers off one at a time, and watched as the man suffered before finally killing him. Remembering he had to take something back to Carmine, Richard cut off the man's head and put it in a plastic bag before burying what was left of his battered corpse. When Richard presented the bag to Carmine, he was rewarded with $10,000. At that moment, Richard had proved if a job needed doing, he was the man to do it, and Carmine started using him as his chief collector and enforcer. Had Richard been Italian, Carmine would have sponsored Richard into the family, but as a Pole, that was never going to happen. But he was now known as a dangerous mob-related guy who everyone respected and feared. Richard wasn't very selective about the jobs he accepted, although he would never take on anything involving women or children. His work didn't always revolve around murder. He would run drugs, collect money, and use his strength to recover debts. He earned good money but often wasted most of it on gambling and alcohol. Occasionally, he would give money to Linda and their 2 sons, but it wasn't long before their marriage began to deteriorate. One of the biggest early hits Richard did for Carmine was a mob boss called Arthur DiGilio. It was unusual for crime families to kill their own, but this guy had been stealing from the head of the family, so he had to go, and he had to suffer as well. Richard's remit was that after he had tortured him to death, he had to shove his credit cards up DiGilio's backside. Richard gladly obliged, and in the process, killed DiGilio's driver and nephew, just because he was in the way. This murder was a big deal, and Richard's reputation spread, and he started working for other Mafia families. No matter how grisly the instruction, you could rely on Richard to follow it to the letter. Richard's marriage to Linda was pretty much over, but Richard was still fiercely protective of her and would flip if another man so much as looked at her. So when he found out she had a lover, he went ballistic. He beat the guy so badly that he broke every bone in his body apart from his femur. He also attacked Linda and cut both her nipples off. After the incident, Richard rarely saw Linda and only occasionally his 2 sons. By the age of 24, Richard was a serial killer, a chronic alcoholic with a gambling addiction. He was still killing anyone who annoyed him or who he was paid to kill, and was still making trips to Manhattan to feed his murderous rages. When asked later in his life how many down and outs he killed for fun in Manhattan, he estimated around 50. His gambling was also out of control, and any money he made was going on that. He was not a happy man, and the more angry and disillusioned he got, the more he wanted to kill. His psychosis was out of control, and when he found out his brother Joe was gay, he nearly killed him. He beat him mercilessly and became estranged from him for many years. Richard had also lost one of his early allies. Carmine Galante, he'd been murdered, shot in the head whilst cooking in his kitchen. With the work drying up and his debts getting out of control, Richard eventually got a straight job with a trucking company, although he soon turned this into a money-making venture and started stealing the goods and hijacking the trucks. At 26, Richard claimed he had already killed 65 men. His life was going nowhere, and his inner rage was festering. But everything changed for Richard when he met 18-year-old American-Italian Barbara Pedrici. They worked together at a trucking company, but Richard was eventually fired for speaking to her. At first, Barbara was unsure about Richard. He was older and still married to Linda, while she was young and didn't take the relationship too seriously. Although Richard was always polite and attentive, her family disapproved of him, not just because of the age difference and his marital status, but also because he wasn't Italian. Despite their reservations, they accepted him into their family for Barbara's sake, and it was during this time that Richard realized what a proper family felt like. However, Richard began to stifle Barbara. She was young and wanted to go out with friends and date other men, and when Barbara tried to end the relationship, Richard, who usually doted on her, drew a knife and threatened to kill her and her family. From that moment on, Barbara was terrified of what Richard might do. Eventually, Richard managed to charm her back, and before long, Barbara became pregnant. Richard wanted to marry her, even though he was still married to Linda. But Barbara couldn't think of anything worse, and in a desperate bid to get away from him, she fled the home she lived in with her mother and her nan and went to live with her father in Miami. Richard had no idea where she was, but he hounded her family to tell him. Eventually, Barbara's mother gave in and told Richard she would give him money to divorce Linda, and she would tell him where Barbara was as long as he married her so she wasn't an unmarried mother. Richard readily agreed. He divorced Linda and, much to the horror of Barbara, turned up on her father's doorstep in Miami. Barbara was furious with her mother and never forgave her, but she was so terrified of what Richard might do to her and her family that she agreed to marry him. In 1961, they got married, and at first, Richard was so infatuated with Barbara that he treated her well and promised to change. Barbara had no idea that her new husband was a serial killer, or that he was involved with the mob. However, not long after their wedding, Richard saw his pregnant wife smoking, and in a fit of rage, he stomped on her toe and broke it, then made her sleep on the porch all night. The next day, Barbara lost the baby. In October 1962, Barbara and Richard returned to New Jersey, and Richard was determined to go straight. Barbara's uncle got him a job at the 20th Century Film Lab in Manhattan, and Richard quickly progressed to a printer and started bootlegging Disney films. The couple eventually moved into a small apartment, and Barbara became pregnant again. Unfortunately, she suffered another miscarriage. By this time, Richard had begun to regularly beat his wife over the slightest issues. When she became pregnant for a third time, he assaulted her so badly that she lost that child as well. Barbara later became pregnant for the fourth time, but their financial situation was dire, and it wasn't long before Richard resorted to crime again, reaching out to some of his old contacts in Jersey City. He soon found a job hijacking a truck and made $12,000. Around the same time, he had an altercation with two young men after he accidentally cut them off in traffic. They reacted angrily. And although Richard initially gave them a chance to walk away, when they refused, he shot them both in the head, leaving their bodies next to their car on the highway. Barbara gave birth to a little girl named Merrick, but it soon became clear that the baby had health issues and spent a lot of time in and out of the hospital. During this period, Richard was a model father. He doted on his daughter and cared for her deeply. The love he showed convinced Barbara that her husband wasn't so bad after all. Soon, Barbara became pregnant again and gave birth to another girl, whom they named Kristen. However, money was still tight. No matter how many hours Richard worked at the film lab or how many counterfeit films he sold, they were still struggling financially. By the time Barbara became pregnant again, Richard was looking for another significant crime opportunity to improve their situation. Richard and two of his associates were hired to hijack a truckload of Casio watches, but when they arrived with the haul, the guy who hired them refused to pay the agreed amount, so Richard shot him point blank. He then went on to shoot 3 of his associates who were waiting to unload the truck. Richard and the 2 others then took the haul for themselves and sold the stock to a guy named Phil Solimene, a crook that would sell anything and everything from his discount store in Patterson. Everything he sold was stolen. Solimene was the one who informed Richard about the lucrative nature of the porn business. Soon after, Richard enlisted the help of some corrupt employees at the film lab, and they began distributing and bootlegging hardcore porn. This venture eventually led Richard to meet Anthony Argrilla, an associate of the Gambino crime family. Richard started selling bootleg porn to the Gambino family, who had a stronghold on porn shops throughout the United States. The extra hours Richard was putting in at the lab started to rile some of the other workers, and he was called out for it by one of the union guys. As always, Richard's answer was violence, and as the two discussed the matter, Richard swung for him. He didn't mean to kill him, but he hit his head as he fell and died instantly. Richard had to think fast, so he got a rope and hung the guy by the neck from a tree to make it look like suicide. As with all his previous murders, suspicion never fell on Richard. Eventually, Richard quit the film lab and concentrated solely on the porn business. He teamed up with Paul Rothenberg and Tony Agrilla, who were responsible for almost all the porn produced in New York. He struck a deal with them. They supplied the shipments of porn movies, and he wholesaled it across the East Coast, and they would take their cut when he was paid. The venture proved to be lucrative, but Richard made a near-fatal mistake. Instead of paying Rothenberg and Agrilla what he owed them, he used the money to expand into making porn movies. Richard hired people to make the movies. He never attended the shoots and thought people who participated in such things were sleazy. All he was interested in was the money he was making. Demero was an out-of-control psychopathic killer and an associate of the Gambino crime family who came with his own infamous reputation as a cruel hitman. After having a word with Richard, Demeo was unimpressed at the way Richard disrespected him, and as Richard walked out the office, he was cornered by Demeo and 2 other men who beat and pistol-whipped him. Richard knew better than to fight back and took the beating that landed him in hospital and left him with a prominent scar on his forehead. Although the two later worked together, Richard vowed that one day he would get revenge for the attack and kill Demeo. After the incident, Richard met with Demeo, and they developed a mutual respect for one another. Subsequently, Demeo regularly hired him as a debt collector, enforcer, and hitman. Richard proved his worth by cold-bloodedly shooting a man in the back of the head right in front of Demeo and his gang. Richard was making good money, not only from the porn industry, but from selling counterfeit goods and doing the odd hit. He lavished the money on his family, buying his wife and children anything they wanted. They even moved to a swanky new house in Dumont, New Jersey. The family installed a pool and held barbecues for the neighbors and appeared to be living the American dream. By now, Barbara had also given birth to their son, Dwayne. However, she still had no idea what her husband was really doing for a living, and she still had to endure his frequent tantrums and abuse. One time, he got so mad he broke the kids' toys and ripped out their new kitchen, throwing the sink through the kitchen window. Sometimes he would slap and beat Barbara in front of the children as they screamed at him to stop. But Barbara always tried to stand up to her husband. She never backed down and goaded him sometimes to hit her. In a strange way, he respected and loved her more for that. At times, he became so angry that he would punch himself, often knocking himself out cold. Barbara realized she could never leave him, knowing he would likely harm them all if she did. Richard never physically hit or abused his children, but the psychological impact of witnessing him beat their mother deeply affected them. However, Richard could also be very kind and generous to others, often giving money to complete strangers or handing out toys to children. He was the epitome of a Jekyll and Hyde character. Roy Demeo was calling on Richard more and more to do specialized jobs for him, and now his main occupation was killing. The more he killed, the more sadistic his methods became, leaving scores of people dead, often mangled, tortured, burned, buried alive, fed to rats, crabs, or thrown into bottomless pits. Demeo was the premier hitman for the Gambinos and other mob families, and Richard was Demeo's premier hitman. It wasn't just the Gambinos Richard worked for. Because he wasn't Italian, and so would never be made, he was able to work for all the East Coast crime families, including the Pontus and the Cavalcante of New Jersey, amongst others. He carried out each hit alone, with careful and meticulous planning, never leaving a trace of him behind. One job he was required to do was to get rid of his old porn associate Paul Rothenberg, a hit he carried out in broad daylight as Rothenberg waited for his wife to go shopping. Watched much to Richard's annoyance by Demeo and his mob. Richard was furious at the intrusion, and on the drive home, a guy cut him up. So when he stopped at the lights, he pulled alongside him and shot him in the head and drove off. Just another random unsolved murder never linked to Richard. One particularly grisly murder was on a guy who had raped a 14-year-old girl. Richard tied the guy to a tree and ripped out his genitalia with his gloved hands and finished the job off with a knife before putting the remains in a sandwich bag. He then proceeded to slice bits of flesh off the guy's body, rubbing salt into the wounds before slicing his stomach so his guts were hanging out. The man was still alive, but in absolute agony. However, Richard wasn't finished. He cut the guy down, put a life jacket on him, and threw him into a shark-infested sea. On the drive home, he again got into a road rage altercation with 3 men. He pulled over into a lay-by, followed by the 3 men in their vehicle. And before they knew what was happening, Richard shot all 3 of them in the head. He then calmly drove back to Roy Demeo and handed him the sandwich bag of genitalia. Richard enjoyed torturing the rapist so much he started writing down in a notebook new ways that he could kill and torture his victims. A lot of what he came up with came from movies he watched, or children's programs like Roadrunner and The Wile E. Coyote. Throwing people out of windows, the use of booby traps, fires, and heavy weights all came from the cartoon. The use of wet rawhide and pouring hot water in people's noses and the salt rubbing all came from movies, as did handing a live hand grenade to a mark before running. Richard killed all over America, and sometimes overseas in Europe and South America. Sometimes he left bodies where they dropped. Sometimes he dropped them down bottomless pits or fed them to rats or sharks. Anyone who didn't pay their dues to the big crime families could expect a visit from Richard and would often endure a slow, torturous death. Richard showed absolutely no mercy. He killed not only for money, but because he enjoyed it, and he was so efficient that the police had no idea who he was. Sometimes Richard was required to dispose of bodies in a certain way, and often corpses were stuffed in oil drums and set on fire before being buried or crushed to form a cube and sold as scrap metal to the Japanese car-making industry. Richard would later say, "That is what happened to Jimmy Hoffa," although there is no proof of this. Richard also experimented with wet rawhide that he would wrap around a live victim's body before leaving him out in the sun. So it dried and wrapped tightly around their limbs and genitals. He would then throw them to the rats to be eaten alive. On occasion, Richard would return to the scene to make sure the rats had done their job, and all he would find was gnawed bones. The rats would strip the flesh from their bodies in hours. Richard even started filming these hits and watched them back for pleasure. Some of the footage was so grisly, even the psychotic killing machine Roy Demeo couldn't bear to watch it. One of the reasons Richard stayed off the radar was that he mainly worked alone. He always planned meticulously, wore gloves, and rarely shared his name with anyone except his closest confidants, who only knew him as Big Rich. Additionally, since most crime families had police officers on their payroll who could help them out in tricky situations, Richard was able to continue his killing spree unchecked and undetected. In 1976, Carlo Gambini, the head of the biggest, most successful crime family in history, died of natural causes. His death rocked the family, and the top job was handed to his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. This proved to be a mistake. Castellano lacked the cunning instincts of Carlo, which led him to make mistakes. He also failed to notice the surveillance and listening devices that the FBI had planted in his home and the places he frequented. After Carlo's death, an opportunity arose for Roy Demeo to be initiated into the Gambino crime family, and by spring of 1976, Demeo was officially welcomed into the Gambino fold, fulfilling a long-held dream. As more assignments came Demeo's way, Richard also benefited, averaging 4 to 6 contracts every month. Roy Demeo's reputation as a ruthless killer spread far and wide, establishing him as the undisputed lethal enforcer of the Gambino family. No one matched the extraordinary ruthlessness of Demeo and his gang of serial killers. Richard was an essential part of this killing machine. He could be called upon to carry out any heinous murder that Demeo demanded, and there were many. Demeo eliminated anyone who stood in his way, anyone who disrespected him or posed a threat, often using the most cruel methods possible. Unlike Richard, however, Demeo was not a silent assassin. He surrounded himself with a gang of hard-partying, coked-up, psychotic hitmen, which would ultimately contribute to his downfall. Richard was now a partner with Demeo in the porn business, but despite their outwardly friendly appearance, Richard still held a seething resentment towards Demeo and still vowed in his head that one day he would kill him. It was Demeo who introduced Richard to feeding victims to sharks. He witnessed it when Demeo took him and a few of his hitmen out fishing off Sheepshead Bay. When the boat was way out at sea, Demeo turned on one of his hitmen, accusing him of being a rat. He shot the guy without killing him and fed him to the sharks. The experience amused and excited Richard and gave him another method of disposing of bodies. It was around this time Richard also looked into poisoning as a way of killing. He was still friends with Phil Solimene, and he knew if anyone could get hold of the right stuff to kill a man, it would be him. Phil introduced Richard to a guy named Paul Hoffman, who not only could get Richard all the poison he needed, but he also gave him instructions of the amounts to use and how to administer them for maximum effect. He settled on cyanide. Richard Kuklinski and cyanide would prove to be a deadly combination. He carried out his first hit using cyanide on a guy called Tony Scavelli. Richard stalked the guy until he ended up in a club, and with the precision of a doctor, Richard injected the cyanide into the mark as he mingled on the dance floor. Scavelli went down dead within a minute. Everyone assumed he had suffered a heart attack, and the cyanide was not detected at his autopsy. Richard had committed the perfect murder. Poison was to become Richard's new favorite way of killing. There was no violence, no blood, and little chance of getting caught. Richard knew just the right amount to kill, but not be detected. Many of the hits he carried out by poisoning were written off as suicides or natural causes. Sometimes he would inject it. Sometimes put it in a drink, sprinkle it on food, or cut it with a line of coke. Richard became an expert in the application of deadly substances, and his services were becoming more sought after than ever. He even started administering the poison through a tranquilizer gun after he watched a wildlife program. Sometimes, he'd use this method to sedate a mark he wanted to torture before killing them. On February 14, 1975, American labor union leader and activist Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. His case is still discussed today, and his legacy continues to spark debate. Hoffa was known to be involved in organized crime, and it has long been believed that the Mafia murdered him and disposed of his body. After Richard was arrested, he claimed that a hitman named Sal Briguglio was responsible for Hoffa's murder. When word spread that Kuklinski was speaking to the police about the case, Hoffa's remains were allegedly dug up by the mob, compacted in the trunk of a car, and exported as a cube to Japan. Whether there is any truth to Kuklinski's claims is known only to Richard. Robert Pronge was a hitman who carried out his business disguised as an ice cream man. Richard befriended him after their paths crossed several times, and Richard was impressed with the Mr. Softee guys. Richard discovered that Mr. Softee employed a variety of weapons for his killings, including grenades and poison. However, Pronge had a unique approach. He administered his poison using a spray bottle, mixing cyanide with dimethyl sulfoxide, a solvent that can be easily absorbed through the skin. Richard soon adopted this method of killing. Both Richard and Pronge were kindred spirits, united by their shared passion for killing. They undertook multiple contracts for the Mafia together. As their partnership grew, Richard and Pronge accompanied each other on jobs, both equally impressed by each other's techniques. Carmine Galante was acting boss of the Bonanno crime family, but after spending a spell in jail, Galante was out of control, and the other Mafia families decided enough was enough and they wanted him taken out. This was a highly unusual move. It was virtually unknown in 1979 for the head of a crime family to have a contract on his head. The families met to plan the hit, and Demeo suggested Richard was the best man for the job. This was a huge deal for Richard. He had the backing of the most powerful Mafia families in New York to take out a Mafia boss. Richard was honored. In a well-orchestrated plan, Richard shot Galante on July 12, 1979, just as he finished lunch at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Brooklyn. Galante's 3 bodyguards were also targeted, and as Richard calmly walked out of the restaurant, the job was finished off by 3 other gunmen who rained bullets down on the party. The next morning, a picture of the murdered Gallant appeared in the newspapers. This assassination was a big deal. Richard laid low for a few days, staying in the office he had secretly acquired, before returning to his family and taking them on a trip to Disney World. On February 1, 1980, Richard and his business associate, George Malliband, were driving to New Jersey. After a heated argument, during which Malliband threatened Richard's family, Richard abruptly stopped the van. Without warning, he pulled a .38 caliber revolver from his pocket and shot Malliband in the chest 5 times, killing him. Richard then attempted to dispose of the body by stuffing it into a 55-gallon drum. However, since Malliband was a large man, Richard had to cut the tendons in his legs to make him fit. He subsequently allowed the drum to roll down to the bottom of a palisade near the Chemitex chemical plant in Jersey City. The body was discovered a few days later, revealing Richard's careless handling of the situation, which was unusual for someone known for being meticulous in disposing of corpses. This incident marked the first murder directly linked to Richard, as Malliband's brother informed the police that George had been on his way to meet Big Rich the day he vanished. On March 18, 1980, Frank, the 12-year-old son of John Guardi, who would later become the boss of the Gambino family, was run over and killed by John Favara, a family friend and neighbor. While Frank's death was ruled an accident, the Gotti family refused to accept this conclusion. As a result, Favara received death threats and was attacked by Gotti's wife, Victoria, with a baseball bat when he attempted to apologize. On July 20, 1980, John Favara disappeared. After his arrest, Richard claimed that he and a few accomplices were responsible for Favara's death. Richard stated that they abducted Favara after he finished work and drove him to a junkyard in East New York, where he was beaten and tortured by Richard and his henchmen. Eventually, Favara's body was stuffed into a 55-gallon drum. Favara's body has never been found, but the claim by Richard has been largely dismissed as demented ramblings. Although Richard's main income came from being a hired hitman, he also engaged in other business ventures, including running a break-in crew made up of 4 associates he had met over the years through his dealings with Phil Solimene. One of the individuals who purchased the stolen goods was Louis Mazgay, who, like Solimene, resold the items through his store in Pennsylvania. However, Mazgay made the mistake of continuously badgering Richard for more and more merchandise, which began to annoy him. On July 1, 1981, Mazgay arrived at Phil Solimene's store looking for blank tapes. Coincidentally, Richard had just brought in a shipment from a recent job, so Solimene called him to inform him that Mazgay was there with cash to buy the haul. A short time later, Richard arrived armed with a gun. He asked Solimene where Mazgay was, and Solimene replied that he was in the restroom. Calmly, Richard walked in and shot Mazgay twice in the head, killing him instantly. Afterward, the two men took the cash that Mazgay had hidden in his van to pay for the tapes, and then drove Mazgay's body to a warehouse where they dumped it in a well containing freezing cold water. Richard had previously seen Robert Pronge freeze bodies to disguise the time of death, and he thought the well might have the same effect, allowing him to later remove the body and make it appear that Mazgay had died much later than he actually had. He placed the body in the well and covered it with a tire, some wood, and a shallow layer of concrete. Then, he left Mazgay's van on the side of the road, miles away from Solimene's shop. Richard believed he had successfully completed another job, or so he thought. The problem arose when Phil Solimene, with his loose tongue, told one of Richard's housebreaking gang members, a man named Percy House, all about the murders of George Malliband and Louis Mazgay. Richard first came to the attention of Pat Kane, a detective in the New Jersey State Police, when, with help from an informant, he connected him to the gang who were carrying out burglaries in New Jersey. The name Big Rich kept coming up, and Kane wanted to get to the bottom of who he was and what he was up to. He established the gang members were Danny Deppner, Gary Smith, Percy House, and the boss Big Rich. But the gang were elusive, and apart from Percy House, Kane couldn't track the rest of them down. Whilst the investigation was going on, Richard later claimed he carried out 15 murders, all Mafia sanctioned. He got rid of the bodies by either dismembering them and dumping pieces in various dumpsters in the city, or cutting them in pieces and putting them in 55-gallon drums with holes in which he dumped in the Hudson River, where they would sink to the bottom and crabs would crawl through the holes and devour what was left of them. Eventually, Kane's dogged determination to get to the truth led him to Danny Deppner's wife, Barbara, who also had an affair with Percy House. Barbara spilled the beans, and finally, after all these years, the name Richard Kuklinski was known to the police. Barbara informed Kane that Richard was aware the police was searching for the other gang members following Percy House's arrest. He had advised them to lay low, but Gary Smith disobeyed and visited his daughter. As punishment, Richard gave him a hamburger laced with cyanide. However, Smith did not die immediately, so Richard had Danny Deppner finish him off by strangling him with a wire from a lamp. Afterward, the pair left Smith's body under the bed in their hotel room. It wasn't discovered for 4 days, even though unsuspecting patrons occupied the room and slept in the bed. Eventually, the smell became unbearable, yet no one thought to look under the bed for several more days. Similar to the situation with Malliband, Richard made the mistake of not disposing of the body. Kane realized he was now not only dealing with a group of thieves, but also a homicidal maniac who killed a man for simply visiting his 5-year-old daughter. It wasn't long before Richard discovered that Barbara Deppner had been talking to the police about Gary Smith's murder. Furious, he realized that Daniel must have informed her, which meant he too had to die. Richard had moved Deppner into an apartment belonging to Rich Patterson, the fiancé of his daughter Merrick. Rich was away at the time, but Richard had access to the apartment. Richard prepared a beef sandwich laced with cyanide for Deppner. As he lay dying on the ground, Richard shot him in the head. When Rich returned to the apartment, Richard convinced him to help dispose of the body, claiming Deppner had died of an overdose. Since Richard had already wrapped the body in a black plastic bag, Rich asked no questions. The body was then dumped near a reservoir in West Milford. As we mentioned earlier, Paul Hoffman was the guy that supplied and taught Richard how to administer poison, but Richard had never liked him. So when Hoffman got pushy with Phil Solimene and Richard about getting hold of a drug called Tagamet, he in effect signed his own death warrant. On 21st April 1982, Hoffman showed up at Phil Solimene's store with a wad of cash on the pretense of buying a load of Tagamet. However, it was a trap, They told Hoffman that the drug was being stored at Richard's warehouse, and the pair made their way over there. Hoffman handed over $25,000 in cash, and that's when Richard told him that the deal was a ruse, and he placed the barrel of his pistol under Hoffman's chin and pulled the trigger. The shot only wounded Hoffman, so Kuklinski tried to shoot him again, only for the gun to jam. Richard then resorted to killing Hoffman by beating him to death with a tire iron. He then stuffed Hoffman's corpse inside a 50-gallon drum, filled the drum with instant cement, and brazenly left it on the sidewalk outside a motel behind a luncheonette called Harry's Corner in South Hackensack, New Jersey. Richard monitored the drum for some time, sitting in Harry's Corner every day to listen for talk amongst the patrons that would indicate the body's discovery. After some time, the drum disappeared. Where it went, no one knew, and to this day, Hoffman's body has not been recovered. The start of 1983 was not a good time for Roy Demeo. The FBI had been investigating the enormous number of missing and murdered persons who were linked to him. He had also upset the Gambinos with some of his wild deals, murderous ways and double-crossing, and was essentially a dead man walking. There is a lot of speculation about who actually murdered Demeo, but we will just look at Richard's version of events. Richard was all too aware of Demeo's troubles, and when they met up, he was shocked by his friend's disheveled appearance. It looked as though he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Demeo unloaded his troubles to Richard, revealing that he was about to be charged with the murder of the Espositos. Richard felt uneasy about Demeo's state of mind. He was concerned because he knew all the details of Demeo's previous murders, and if Demeo started talking to the police or sought a deal, Richard could be in serious danger. As they continued to talk, Richard suddenly pulled a gun on Demeo and shot him 5 times, hitting him twice in the head. Richard had finally achieved his revenge for the humiliation Demeo had inflicted on him all those years ago. He then stuffed Demeo's body into the trunk of his own Cadillac and placed a lamp from the back seat on top of the body. Richard walked away thinking to himself, "Dead men can't speak." In 1984, Robert Pronge, aka Mr. Softee, asked Richard to murder his ex-wife and 8-year-old son. Richard refused, as although he was a cold-hearted, ruthless killer, he never killed women or children. The final straw for Richard came when he discovered that Pronge planned to poison an entire reservoir with ricin just to kill one family. Incensed by this plan, the 2 men fell out, and Pronge threatened Richard, saying, "I know where you live." Richard knew that Pronge was capable of anything, so he had to take action. On August 10th, 1984, Pronge was found dead in his Mr. Softee truck with 2 bullet wounds in his chest. Not long after Pronge's murder, Richard decided to stop leasing the warehouse where he had carried out so many killings. However, first he needed to retrieve Louis Masquet's body from the well. As Richard had hoped, the body had been perfectly preserved by the freezing water, and even though he had been killed 2 years earlier, his corpse looked as fresh as if he had died the day before. Richard dumped the body wrapped in black plastic in a little-known area of upstate New York. Surprisingly, the body was discovered just a few days later. With the discovery of the murder victims and the information that Pat Kane had uncovered over many months, he became convinced that Richard Kuklinski was responsible. He had gathered a substantial amount of information on Richard and had tracked his movements and those of his family. However, he still did not have enough evidence to make an arrest, and he was concerned for his own family if Richard learned that he was onto him. Despite these challenges, Kane was determined not to give up. He knew that Richard was a mob contract killer and a distributor of pornography, and he suspected that Richard was responsible for the deaths of at least 5 people. However, Kane's relentless pursuit of Richard, coupled with minimal support from his superiors, began to take a toll on him. He became consumed by the case, falling into depression and drinking too much. He desperately needed a break and, more importantly, tangible evidence to bolster his investigation. Kane decided that the only way to reach Richard was to send someone undercover. He chose Dominic Polifrone, a veteran who had experience with these types of assignments and had successfully infiltrated criminal gangs in the past. Polifrone looked the part, had the mannerisms of a mobster, and was a perfect fit for the circles Richard frequented. After hearing Kane's description of Richard, Polifrone became just as determined to capture him as Kane was. Their partnership would evolve into one of the largest state and federal law enforcement efforts in New Jersey's history. Both men believed that the key to getting close to Richard lay in Phil Solimene, the person Richard trusted most, aside from his wife. It wasn't an easy task to get Solimene to cooperate, but as luck would have it, he had recently been picked up by the police. That's when Kane approached him. Kane also had some leverage. Solimene's son was in prison, and Solimene himself was facing a possible sentence. This gave Kane the opportunity to strike a deal. Solimene could keep his freedom and help his son have an easier time. The plan was for Solimene to introduce Polifrone to Richard as a longtime trusted friend. Polifrone would use the alias Dominic Provenzano. In early 1985, Dominic was dropped off at Solimene's shop, where he was greeted warmly as an old friend. He was introduced to the regular customers and quickly became a fixture at the store, gaining acceptance among the criminal fraternity that frequented the place. Dominic boasted that he could obtain any weapon they wanted. Everything was in place except for one thing. Richard Kuklinski was nowhere to be seen. Phil Solimene even called him to tell him he had some good stuff come in, but Richard told me he was too busy to drop by. For some time, head of the Gambino family, Paul Castellano, had become a problem. The official story is that Gambino underboss Sammy Gravano suggested killing both Castellano and his bodyguard Thomas Bilotti. However, when John Gotti got wind of the plan, he arranged for him to be killed. However, Richard's version of events is slightly different. He claims he had a meeting with Gravano about the hit and was hired to kill Thomas Bilotti, and someone else would deal with Castellano. Whatever the truth is, on Monday, December 16, 1985, Bilotti drove Castellano to a prearranged early evening meeting at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. A hit squad was waiting for them, all wearing Russian fur hats, including Richard, whose job was to eliminate Bilotti. The hit was carried out smoothly and efficiently. Richard left the scene, hailed a taxi out of town, and collected $30,000 for his efforts. Later that evening, he sat down with his wife and watched the news coverage of Castellano's demise. It's said that John Carneglia was the gunman who shot Castellano in the head, and before leaving the murder scene, Gotti drove over to view the bodies. Eventually, Richard agreed to meet up with Solimene, but refused to go to the shop. He warned Solimene that the police were onto him, and that he should get rid of the shop. Despite this, Solimene still wanted Richard to meet Polifrone, claiming he could get Richard anything. Richard replied that he was too busy, but inquired if Solimene could get him some cyanide. Polifrone had been a regular at Solimene's shop for over a year, but Richard hadn't set foot in the place. He was still focused on his overseas deals and occasional hits. Kane decided to take a different approach. Knowing where Richard lived, he paid him a visit. Kane and a colleague knocked on Richard's front door. Richard opened it and invited the officers in, menacingly denying any knowledge of the 5 murders Kane questioned him about, though he did admit to knowing Roy Demeo. As he showed the cops out, Richard was furious. How dare they come to his home? He decided that Kane had to pay with his life. For the next few weeks, Richard stalked Kane, fully intending to kill him. However, he knew he would need to make it look like an accident to avoid attracting police attention. With no current supplier for cyanide, having killed the 2 contacts that usually supplied him, Richard contacted Solimene and asked about a guy named Dominic Polifrone. Finally, after waiting over a year, Richard agreed to meet Polifrone at Dunkin' Donuts, ironically to ask him to procure cyanide to kill his colleague, Pat Kane. During the meeting, the 2 exchanged phone numbers, and Polifrone asked Richard to put out feelers for anyone interested in military hardware he could obtain. This was the break Kane had been waiting for, and what happened next caught everyone off guard. Just 2 days after their first meeting, Richard contacted Polifrone, expressing his eagerness to get the cyanide. Polifrone informed Richard that he was working on it. A couple of days later, Richard called again, this time wanting to set up a meeting with his contacts who were interested in the arms Polifrone claimed he could acquire. The quick turnaround for these requests left the authorities without enough time to establish surveillance or determine how to handle the situation. The operation was now being taken seriously by Chief Prosecutor Bob Carroll, who named it Operation Iceman. It was decided that Richard had to be stalled. They had long given up on attempting to trail him, as he was too savvy for that. Instead, they opted to tap his and his family's phone calls. In reality, Richard had no intention of setting up an arms deal with Polifrone. He didn't like the guy, and he planned to use another guy he didn't like, who he called Tim, as a ruse for the deal. Then he would kill them both. With this in mind, on September 25, 1986, Richard called Polifrone from a payphone to set up the deal. Polifrone called him back immediately. He was all wired up and ready to set the trap. Astonishingly, Richard fell straight into it. After Polifrone had spoken to Tim about the arms deal, he asked to speak to Richard again. Polifrone was good. He talked the talk, and Richard started singing like a canary. First, he agreed to supply Polifrone with silencers. Polifrone pressed Richard about his intended use for the cyanide, and Richard explained that it was meant to eliminate some rats. He detailed how he planned to use it as a spray, making it harder to detect, and mentioned that he had successfully used it on several occasions before. Polifrone then inquired if Richard would be willing to carry out a couple of contracts for him. Richard agreed, provided the price was right. The two men agreed to stay in touch, and Richard gave Polifrone a new pager number. Little did Richard know that when he hung up the phone, he had essentially signed his own warrant. Every word of his admission had been recorded. Continually trying to stall Richard was not a good move, and eventually he lost interest in doing any business with Polifrone, and their phone calls became stunted with Richard obviously not interested, believing Polifrone was stringing him along. Soon Richard stopped calling or answering Polifrone's calls and failed to turn up to prearranged meetings. Richard still wanted to kill Kane, and he also added Polifrone to the list. He was still making frequent trips to Zurich and still killing people who got in his way, but he'd given up on getting cyanide from Polifrone and started asking elsewhere to obtain the poison. The police had no idea Richard was making trips to Europe, but to try and find out where he was, Kane and a colleague visited Richard's house again. Barbara answered the door but denied any knowledge of Richard's whereabouts. They told her they were looking for him in connection with murder. This was the first time Barbara had ever questioned what Richard was up to. She never asked any questions about where all the money came from. She knew he was into dodgy deals but had no idea he was involved in murdering people. When Richard found out what the police had said to her, he was livid. He just wanted to get Kane out of the way. He was getting desperate, but he still couldn't get hold of the cyanide he needed to carry out the job. Richard was so desperate, he thought he'd give Polifrone another try. They arranged to meet, and again, Richard talked extensively about how to kill with cyanide and how to dispose of the body in a deep pit. Surprisingly, he also told Polifrone that he once froze a body to fake the time of death. The pair also talked about killing a young Jewish drug dealer Polifrone wanted bumped off. All these admissions were being taped, although Polifrone had already figured out that Richard was only telling him these things because he planned to kill him after he had delivered the cyanide. The pair agreed to meet again, and Polifrone had come up with an elaborate plan to use the cyanide he obtained to kill the Jewish drug dealer by poisoning an egg sandwich. Richard went along with the plot, but in his mind he was just going to blast the both of them. The meeting was arranged for December 17, 1986. On the morning of December 17th, Richard met Polifrone as arranged. Polifrone handed over the egg sandwiches and vial of cyanide, and the plan was that Richard would go and get the coke for the dealer and return with it in his van. After the dealer handed the money over, they would all go to a cafe, and Richard would serve up the poisoned sandwich. Polifrone said he would pick up the dealer and meet him in 30 minutes. However, Richard smelt a rat. He wasn't sure what, but something wasn't right. He thought in his mind he would meet them and lure them back to his warehouse saying the coke was there, and then kill both of them. As he drove off, he wondered what was going on. He stopped and looked at the vial of cyanide. It didn't smell or look like usual. Still unsure, he bought a burger and laced part of it with the cyanide and fed it to a stray dog. When nothing happened, he knew he'd been set up. Richard didn't return to meet Polifrone. Instead, he went home. The cops that were surveying his house were surprised to see him, and it was soon realized the sting had been foiled. The task force was notified, and they decided to swoop there and then. Up to 15 unmarked squad cars made their way to Richard's house. Richard and Barbara had just gotten into their car. Barbara wasn't feeling well, and he was taking her to the doctor's office. As they drove down the road, police surrounded their vehicle, catching Richard completely off guard. He considered reaching for his gun, but ultimately decided against it, not wanting to put Barbara at risk if a shootout occurred. Both Richard and Barbara were forcibly removed from the car and pushed to the ground. When Richard saw how they were treating Barbara, he lost control and went berserk. It took 8 officers to restrain him and put him in handcuffs. His impressive size and unexpected strength surprised them, but the game was finally up. In the aftermath of the arrest, the media sensationalized the story with headlines about a mob hitman, freezing bodies, and poisoning people dominating the front pages. Richard quickly earned the nickname the Iceman. During his time in custody, Richard showed little concern for himself, but wanted the police to understand that his wife was completely innocent and unaware of his actions. He behaved like a crazed animal, pacing his cell and cursing, threatening to kill everyone around him. When police searched the Kuklinski home, they were shocked to find no incriminating evidence, no weapons, no freezer full of body parts, nothing. Richard had always been careful to keep his criminal activities separate from his family life, and he was truthful when he insisted that Barbara and their children had no idea what he was doing. Barbara was eventually released from custody, although she was charged with possession of a .25 caliber automatic weapon that had been found under the seat of her car. Prosecutors charged Richard with 5 counts of murder and 6 weapons violations, along with attempted murder, robbery, and attempted robbery. Officials discovered that Richard had large sums of money in Swiss bank accounts and a flight reservation to that country. He was held on a $2 million bail bond and was required to surrender his passport. During his trial, several of Richard's former associates testified against him, including Rich Patterson and Dom Polifrone. The taped conversations with Polifrone were the most damaging evidence presented, although Richard's defense argued that his admissions were merely him blowing smoke in an attempt to impress someone he believed to be a major criminal. In March 1988, a jury found Richard guilty of murdering Smith and Deppner. However, they determined that the deaths were not proven to be a result of Kuklinski's own actions, meaning he would not face the death penalty. To avoid a second trial for the murders of Malliband and Mazgay, Richard agreed to plead guilty to both charges. The state deemed there to be insufficient evidence to convict Richard for Hoffman's murder, since his body had not been recovered. In exchange for a confession and Richard's assistance in locating Hoffman's remains, the charges for that murder were dropped. As part of the plea deal, the charges against his wife for a gun-related issue and an unrelated marijuana possession charge against his son were also dropped. Richard received 2 60-year sentences, one for killing Smith and Deppner, and the other for Malliband and Mazgay, which would run concurrently. He would be eligible for parole in 2046, when he would be 111 years old. He was incarcerated at Trenton State Prison, which was coincidentally where his brother Joe was still serving his sentence. During his time in prison, Richard granted interviews to various individuals, including prosecutors, psychiatrists, criminologists, writers, and television producers. Some of these interviews culminated in 3 televised documentaries known as the Iceman tapes, aired on HBO in 1992, 2001, and 2003. Richard's daughter, Merrick, later admitted that their mother had convinced Richard to do the interviews, and he was paid handsomely for them. In these interviews, Richard confessed to many more killings than he was convicted of, some of which are discussed in this documentary. Allegedly, Richard declined interview requests from Oprah Winfrey and Geraldo Rivera. The exact number of people Richard killed remains unknown. He himself hinted that it could be as many as 200, although he rarely provided specific details such as the victims' full names, locations, or dates. He claimed to have used various methods to avoid establishing a consistent modus operandi that could connect all the murders to one individual. While Richard discussed his crimes in detail, many of his claims have not been substantiated and have been met with skepticism. After Richard's arrest, his family and neighbors were shocked. They were completely unaware of his criminal activities and instead believed he was a successful businessman. His wife did suspect some of his income might come from illegal activities, but she never asked questions about her husband's work or whereabouts. She was content to enjoy the lavish lifestyle the money he brought home afforded them. However, she had no idea he was involved in murder. The Kuklinskis divorced in 1993. Barbara claimed the divorce was for financial reasons. After their separation, she continued to visit Richard in prison, though only about once a year. In October 2005, after nearly 18 years in prison, Richard was diagnosed with Kawasaki disease, which is an inflammation of the blood vessels. He was transferred under guard to St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. Richard had asked doctors to ensure they revived him if he went into cardiac arrest. However, unbeknownst to him, Barbara had signed a "do not resuscitate" order. When the doctors realized Richard was dying, they contacted Barbara to see if she wished to rescind the instruction, but she declined. Richard died at the age of 70 on March 5, 2006, with the official cause of death being cardiac arrest. Richard Kuklinski was an unusual serial killer. It's true he was molded by his childhood, as many killers are. But apart from his violent temper, he had few of the vices common among criminals. He liked to drink, but was often sober when he killed. He did not abuse drugs. None of his murders were sexually motivated, and although he was abusive to his wife, he never once cheated on her. He had a strict rule that he would not kill women or children, and he didn't. His one weakness seemed to be gambling, and he lost a huge amount of money this way. Richard killed if people annoyed him, or someone paid him too. He enjoyed seeing his victims suffer and said he filmed some of his murders to watch back later, although none of the recordings were ever discovered. In his interviews, Richard talked about the details of his horrific murders as if it was a normal everyday thing. He didn't flinch at some of the horrendous descriptions he gave of a human suffering at his hands. However, despite this, those that did interview him liked him. They found him funny and engaging. Even his wife said she loved the nice Richard, but hated the nasty one. Only Richard knows the true number of people he killed. Interestingly, when a serial killer is apprehended, it is not unusual for them to claim responsibility for more murders than they actually committed. There is no doubt that Richard was a sadistic psychopath, but one can't help but wonder, if he had been born into a normal, loving family, could he have grown up to be a decent person? It seems clear that the circumstances of his childhood and upbringing played a significant role in shaping the monster he became.